Hey everyone, welcome to the Grammar and Usage class. For week 10, we will look at relative clauses, another kind of subordinate clause. We have looked at content subordinate clause last week, and now it comes to the relative clause. And the material for this topic is taken from Huddleston and Pullum's book, Chapter 11 on relative clauses. And in this presentation, I will focus on the basic features of relative clauses, different forms of relative clauses in English, WH and non-WH, integrated and supplementary relative clauses, and the fused type of relative clauses. So the main function of relative clause is to modify a noun. In that way, it functions as modifier of a noun, and it is integrated, embedded inside a noun phrase. Here are two examples of relative clause that function as modifiers of nouns. The secretary wrote to all members who were absent from the meeting. The film which I needed is unobtainable. So the underlined part are the relative clauses in these two sentences, and the blue coded words are the nouns that these relative clauses modify. Okay, and as a relative clause, it is introduced by the so-called relative pronouns, such as who or which, and these pronouns are interpreted as referring to the noun, the head noun that the relative clause modifies. So the noun is understood as the antecedents of the relative pronouns, okay? And the relation between these relative pronouns and its antecedents, the one that these pronouns refer to, is called anaphora. Okay, so the relative pronoun can be said to be anaphorically related to the head nouns or the antecedents, such as who is anaphorically related to members and which is anaphorically related to film. Okay, now WH and non-WH relative clauses. We have seen in the previous two examples that relative clause essentially contains relative pronouns that express anaphoric relation to the modified head noun. But relative pronouns can also not having any explicit relative pronouns. Okay, relative clause can not have explicit relative pronouns. That's what I want to say. And those relative clauses that explicitly contain relative pronouns such as who or which are called the WH relative clauses, while those that do not have explicit relative pronouns, they are called non-WH. Okay, and the non-WH relative clauses here can be divided into two types: the that relative clause and the bare relative clause. Yeah, so the WH relative clauses, we have seen two examples, and here it is repeated again once more. And the non-WH relative clauses, one of them is the that relative clauses, such as the film that I needed is not obtainable, and the bare relative clauses, the film I needed is not obtainable. So the bare relative clauses do not have any explicit relative pronoun. Okay, and in the that relative clauses, it has a relative pronoun, but it is not the WH. Okay, it's just that. And these two slots, these two empty slots, are anaphorically related to the head nouns. Okay, so this slot is supposed to be filled by film in these two non-WH relative clauses, and these empty slots here are called relativized elements. Those are the elements inside the relative clause that are referred to by the head noun and also by the relative pronouns. Okay, and these relativized elements inside the relative clauses can have different functions. They can the relativized elements can be subject inside the relative clause, such as this one, some friends who saw her. Okay, so who here is a relativized element represented by a relative pronoun who, and this element is filling the subject function inside this clause. So who here actually is the subject of saw, but who here is used to refer to a friend. as some friends. But in normal circumstances, so you would say some friends saw her, yeah. And next, the relativized elements can be object, like a key which she found. Okay, so which here anaphorically related to key, but the normal way the standard or declarative sentence for this one is she found a key. Yeah, a key is an object, but it is now modified by relative clause, a key which she found. And the relativized elements can also be complement of preposition, such as in here, well, this should be underlined. So those books which I refer to, yeah, so those books here actually anaphorically related to which, and this relativized elements is the complement of preposition to. So you will say something like, I refer to those books. That's the declarative one, the main clause sentence. Okay, the not relative clause sentence. Okay, and relativized elements can also be adjunct of the relative clause, and these adjuncts can be from time, place, and reason types. So the day when you were born, so when indicates time, a place where you can relax, where is relativized elements of adjunct of place, the reason why she got angry, so why is the relativized elements indicating adjunct of reason. So you would normally say she got angry because of that, and you can relax here. Okay, that's the place. You were born on X date, and so on. All right, so that is the different functions of relativized elements in the WH relative clauses, and these sentences have their counterpart in the non-WH question relative clauses that we will see. And if we see also here that the WH question and WH words used are different depending on the functions of the relativized elements. Okay, so the who pronouns are reserved for people, which for things, when for times, where for places, and why for reasons. Now we will look at the non-WH version of these relative clauses. So yeah, using that relative clause, and if you see the parenthesis around that, it means that here is optional. So you can have that omitted. Yeah, you can use the that relative clause here or the bare relative clause without any relative pronoun. So you can say something like a key she found, those books I refer to, or those books that I refer to. Okay. All right. Now, what is important to notice here is that when the gap, when the relativized element is in the subject position, okay, such as example A, the relative pronoun has to be present. So you cannot omit the WH pronoun or the that pronoun. So like in this example, anyone who wants this cake can have it. That's fine. But when you say anyone wants this cake can have it, that's not a standard English. Okay, so the subject in this case requires the relative pronoun. Yeah, the subject of relative clause needs the relative pronouns, either WH, such as who here, or the that pronoun. Okay. All right, so that's WH and non-WH relative clause. And the relative pronoun part of a relative clause can be complex. It can consist of more than one word. Okay. Before we only look at examples where the relative pronoun is only one element. Yeah, the slot where you have the relative pronoun is typically filled by one word that we have seen so far, and these relative pronouns refer to the head noun as the antecedents of the pronouns. But this slot, the relative pronoun slot, can be complex. Yeah, it can consist of two words such as whose house, from which, and the answer to which. Okay, because this relative pronoun slot is consisting of more than one word, they are also referred to as the relative phrase in this more complex relative clause. Yeah, so these are all of the relative clauses, which is marked by the green line, and these are the relative phrase. Okay, even though the relative phrase consists of more than one word, there is only one relative pronoun inside that. Yeah, there is only one relative pronoun that has the antecedent of the head noun. So in example 3, whose here refers to people. Okay, a possessive relative pronoun. So you would normally say something like, she hasn't been able to contact the people. Yeah, you don't have the simpler one, I think, for number 3, but whose house here is actually referring to the people's house that she is renting. Okay, so not being able to contact the people's house she is renting. And in this part, example 4, which refer to the article. Okay, yeah, article is the antecedent of which, not from. Okay, because this is the relative pronoun. And which in number 5 also refers to problem as the antecedent. Okay, and you see this relative phrase has 4 words inside it. Okay, well, I've tried to make a simpler version of number 3, but maybe that sounds ungrammatical in English. But in number 4 and 5, you can have the simpler version, such as this is the article which they were quoting from. So the preposition is like stranded after the verb. Okay, and which here refers to the article. And number 5, the simpler version is that he set us a problem to which the answer can be found in the textbook. Okay, yeah. So the standard or the main clause sentence of this relative clause is that the answer to the problem can be found in the textbooks. So that's the main clause declarative sentence of this version of relative clause in 5. Okay, now we come to the integrated versus supplementary relative clauses. What does it mean? Integrated versus supplementary relative clauses, they generally refer to the function, what they do in relation to the meaning of the noun that they modify. Okay, so integrated, as its name suggests, it serves to restrict the property, the feature of the head noun, as it is tightly connected to the head noun. So the clause that is indicating the feature property of the noun, it is integrated tightly to the head noun. Okay, strongly associated with the head noun. Meanwhile, supplementary relative clause, yeah, the name suggests it is just supplement. It is more loosely attached to the head noun. So that's why it is supplementary or just additional. Okay, how do they differ? But before we look at their difference, these are examples of integrated versus supplementary relative clause. And you may think that, well, they look almost the same, but if you look at example 7, the relative clause who make extravagant promises, it is marked off, it is set off from the main clause by means of commas. Okay, so but in the example 6, there is no comma separating the relative clause and the other elements in the main clause. Yeah. So orthographic difference in writing is one of the differences between integrated and supplementary relative clauses. So these are the dimensions where you can find the difference between integrated and supplementary relative clauses. Intonation, punctuation, we have seen one with commas. Interpretation, so integrated versus supplementary relative clauses, they carry different interpretation, different meaning, and they also show difference in syntax, okay, in how they are ordered in the sentence. Right. Yeah, in terms of intonation, so integrated relative clause are integrated intonationally into larger construction. It means that there is no pause, or the relative clause is not spoken as separate intonation unit, okay, but it is just like one stream of intonation. But in supplementary relative clause, they are set apart. There will be potentially a pause, yeah, short pause, because the relative clause, the supplementary relative clause will be spoken as a separate intonation unit. So you would say, for example 6, you would say politicians who make extravagant promises are untrusted. Okay, and for 7, you might say something like politicians who make extravagant promises aren't trusted. Okay, so those are the intonation differences between integrated and supplementary relative clause. Okay, but I think what is crucial between these two is how they affect interpretation of the head noun. Okay, the labels integrated and supplementary already reflect the meaning difference between the two relative clause. Well, repeated again, integrated relative clause express information that is central, integral to the larger message, yeah, while supplementary relative clause expresses information that is just additional material. So that's the general idea of the different interpretations. But if we look at the real examples of example 6 and 7, we will get different interpretation of those two sentences. Okay, in example 6, integrated relative clause, politicians who make extravagant promises are untrusted. What does the relative clause do here is to restrict the definition of the politicians. It restricts the definitions of the politicians. What it means is that in this example, the lack of trust, okay, the lack of trust, people don't have trust only to a subset of the politicians. Yeah, so the lack of trust by the people does not apply to all politicians in general, but only to those, only a subset of politicians who makes extravagant promises. Yeah, so the extravagant promises feature property is strongly associated with a subset of politicians, and only those politicians are not trusted. So the other kind of politicians may be trusted because they don't have or they don't make extravagant promises. Okay. Okay. So the information in the relative clause is crucial to the larger message, as the relative clause plays an important role in defining who is said to lack public trust. Okay, who actually lacks public trust? The politicians who make extravagant promises. Okay, yeah. So not all politicians lack of trust, but only those who makes extravagant promises. Okay. All right. 7. How would you interpret this sentence in 7 with supplementary relative clauses? So in this case, the feature or the property of lacking trust applies to politicians in general. Okay, not just a subset of them that we have seen in 6. Yeah, in example 6, only some of the politicians who makes extravagant promises are not trusted. But here, because it is supplementary, so it does not really have a central part of the meaning of politicians. You can omit that, and the sentence in 7 will say something like politicians are not trusted. So politicians in general are not trusted. And the presence, okay, the existence of supplementary relative clause in this example in 7, it adds extra information about politicians in general. Okay, the supplementary relative clause adds further feature of politicians in general, namely, they make extravagant promises. First, politicians in general are not trusted, and with the supplementary relative clauses, it adds additional information about these politicians in general, namely, they make extravagant promises. Okay, so those, if you can see the difference between example 6 and 7, they differ in meaning. Yeah, example 6 refer to only certain politicians that are not trusted because they like making extravagant promises. Meanwhile, in 7, every single politician is not trusted in general, and they like making extravagant promises. Okay. All right. Good. Now, in terms of syntax, the syntax difference between integrated versus supplementary relative clause has to do with the types of the relative pronoun. So, supplementary relative clause are almost always has the WH type as the pronoun, relative pronoun, but bare relative clause without the relative pronoun is not allowed for supplementary relative clauses. Okay. Yeah, so another feature of the syntax difference is that integrated relative clause function tightly as modifier of the head noun. Yeah, it functions very tightly as a modifier of the head noun. Meanwhile, supplementary relative clauses are not that tight in relation to the head noun. They are loosely attached to the head noun, and they may also form separate sentence, such as in this simple dialogue between A and B. So A says, our rent is due next week, and B, using relative clause as independent sentence, which is why we shouldn't be going out to dinner tonight. Okay, so that said by B is supplementary relative clause, and it can stand alone as separate sentence. Okay, but the integrated one cannot be uttered separately, like in this example. Okay, so they need to attach tightly to the head noun. All right. Yeah, and another syntax difference is the type of head noun that is allowed by supplementary relative clause. So supplementary relative clause have more varied type of antecedents, the kind of noun that supplementary relative clause can modify. Supplementary relative clause can accept clauses as the antecedent. Before we only see noun as the antecedents, as well as proper nouns. Okay, so relative clause, supplementary relative clauses can accept clauses as the antecedents as well as proper nouns. If you see example A, Max arrived late, that is a clause. Yeah, we have subject, predicate, but this clause can be the antecedents, can be the item that is modified by this relative clause, the supplementary relative clause. Okay, and example B, Max, a name, proper noun, is the antecedent for the supplementary relative clause. Okay, Max, who was usually very punctual, was 20 minutes late. Okay. All right, so that's it, the differences between integrated versus supplementary relative clauses. Yeah, basically what I think important between integrated and supplementary relative clauses is the different interpretation that can be produced by these two types of relative clauses. Now, what is fused relative clauses? Okay, so far we look at only the relative clause, relative pronoun, and the antecedents. They are all different, especially the relative pronoun and the antecedent. They are different items. But in the fused relative clauses, the antecedents and the relativized element are fused together. So the A sentence in 6 and 7 here, they are all exemplifying fused relative clauses. And in the fused relative clauses, the antecedents and the relativized elements are fused. So what and whoever here refers to both the antecedents as well as the relativized elements. Okay. Yeah. But in the B sentence is the B sentences are the normal or the standard relative clause where the antecedents as well as the relativized elements are separated. They are expressed separately. So the B version of 6a would be the person who said that was trying to mislead you. In 6a, whoever said that was trying to mislead you. Okay, so the combination of the person as well as who. Now 7a, the simpler or the normal relative clause for 7b, the non-fused version. Yeah. For relative clause in 7a is in 7b. I've eaten that which you gave me. But the fused one, the fused version of B is I've eaten what you gave me. Okay. Yeah. So that is fused and non-fused relative clause. Yeah. The key feature of fused relative clauses is that you can have the antecedent as well as the relativized elements as one word. Okay. And yeah, try to create relative clauses with these types of fused relative pronouns. Okay. Yeah. So who, whoever, whomever, whatever, whichever, wherever, whenever. Those are types of relative pronouns in that is possible for fused relative clauses. Yeah. So now, what is the difference between fused relative clauses and the interrogative subordinate clauses that we have seen last week? Well, they turn out to be overlapping to some extent. So these examples 8, 9, 10, they shows how they may overlap. 8 and 9 are a clear-cut example of fused and interrogative subordinate clause respectively, but example 10, it is ambiguous in terms of the interpretation. Thus, what she wrote is unclear refer to fused relative clause or interrogative one. The interpretation can be both. Okay, they are this sentence number 10 is possibly interpreted in terms of fused and interrogative. I think I have, yeah. So so you in the fused one number 8, you can have something like I really like that which she wrote. Okay, but in interrogative subordinate clause in 9, what she wrote here actually refer to the questions, and the sentence as a whole, I wonder what she wrote, it's actually indicating that I wonder about the answer to the question, what did she write? Yeah. But in number 10, you can have two possible interpretations. If you try to interpret example 10 as fused relative clause, the A interpretation will come up. Okay, that which she wrote is unclear. So that would be the fused interpretation, fused relative clause interpretation. And if you want to interpret number 10 as interrogative, you will have sentence B. What is unclear is the answer to the question, what did she write? Okay. Yeah, so that is how fused relative clause may have some relation to the interrogative subordinate clause, because you see they have the same form, what she wrote, and what she wrote. Okay, but in 9 it is interrogative because it is preceded by the verb wonder. We've seen from previous subordinate clause lecture that wonder can have interrogative subordinate clause complement. Okay, but like typically have a noun complement, and here because what can be interpreted as a fused antecedent and relative pronoun, clause in number 8 is also understood as fused relative clause. Okay, I think that's it for today, and I hope you can follow along, but please don't hesitate to email me if you have questions. Alright, have a good day and stay healthy.